Have you ever considered what it would be like to carry out a loved one's wishes at the end of their lives? What if they don't want extreme measures taken to save them and would rather that you let them go? How do you face this kind of situation? My guest for this episode of How to Move Your Mom will share her own experience with us. Moving your mom or your dad or yourself isn't just about moving things from one place to another. It is much more complicated than that, as are so many things having to do with later life. How to Move Your Mom and Still Be on Speaking Terms Afterward provides in-depth conversations with professionals, older adults, and their family members who share their stories with warmth, understanding, and humor. I'm your host, Marty Stevens-Heebner, and here you'll find answers to many of your questions, as well as different perspectives that I hope will inform and inspire you. Welcome, Nancy, to our podcast. I'm so glad you're here.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you. I'm really honored for you to have me on as a guest.
I'm honored that you're my friend and shared the journey you've been on for the last year and a half.
It's been a crazy one, and I want to thank you as being a friend and helping me and supporting in that, because I don't know where I would be without the support of you and several others.
Yeah, our Saturday group, the six of us, really wonderful. So let me first tell you about Nancy a little bit. Until recently, Nancy was a Los Angeles-based production manager and line producer in the entertainment industry. That's been her career for 25 years. Not that you know what to look at her. But more importantly, her mother's death, the pandemic, and her desire for change, a big career change, all converged in February, March of 2020. And that all set her on a completely new and unfamiliar path in a new city on the other side of the country. It's been a remarkable journey for you. And so let's go back to February, March 2020. You know, one thing, obviously anybody hearing this thinks, oh, COVID, yes, but there was so much more going on for you.
My mom all of a sudden had a stroke on February 11th, and I was in the middle of a job. My mom had a transient ischemic attack, and it's basically a temporary stroke. And she had blacked out and had gone to the emergency room, and then had called me as the Oscars were going on, saying, "I love you," kind of thing. And then on Tuesday, which was 2 days later, then my mom had a massive stroke. And it was one that she lost the ability to use her right side of her body. She couldn't speak, and she couldn't really move. So my brother found my mom, and we figured out by what was on TV and her normal schedule that she'd probably been there a couple of hours. She wasn't able to really communicate very well because she lost use of language.
Mm-hmm.
But she, was pretty adamant, I'm in trouble. I know this. My brother did the normal reaction, 911, ambulance going there, the emergency room. They were trying to figure out whether it was a cardiac event or what it was. And then it becomes a thing of, we need to intubate her. And my brother was like, okay, we need to figure out what this is. Because that's part of the problem with the stroke, is you don't know how bad it is. We didn't really know what was going on. They were doing all the tests. Then we found out it was a stroke. And then it was like, I need to come out there. And because I'm like I said, the executor of all of that. And we'd been through this with my father, who had a stroke, and my brother had to deal with that. And my father was like, no, I'm going to be fine. We're going to, work on this. Well, it was 5 years that he survived, but he was in full nursing care the entire time and bedridden. And because of that, my mom was just adamant. She was like, if something like that happens to me, I'm done. Let me die. By the time I got to Huntsville, I was a mess. And I didn't want to see my mom in that situation. And it was past visiting hours anyway, because she was in ICU at that point. So I went and slept.
You're in Huntsville, Alabama now.
Yes.
As opposed to Los Angeles, just to give people an idea of the geography.
And then the next Sunday morning, I went in to see her. And they were trying to take the feeding tube out, or the intubation out, trying to to see what state she was in. She had a couple of days. That was by That was Sunday. And as soon as they put you under a tranquilizer in order to get the tube out, then they need to start slowly bringing you out. So as soon as they did, my mom took my hand and just like started hammering it and just, basically tapping it and giving me that mom look. And it's like, what needs to be done.
Oh, that must have been so hard for you.
Yes and no. Yes, because I realized my mom was going to die, but that had already sort of happened in one sense, because I knew the path that she was going to be miserable, and that there wasn't much. My mom would be there, like she might have survived it, although I don't think she would have been, because she couldn't really swallow. So it would have been a feeding tube and a bunch of stuff that my mom would have hated. She was also very, very practical. And at the point when the cards are stacked against you, then sometimes it's time to fold your hand. And my mom had lived a very full life, and there wasn't much more she wanted to do. She's always talked about quality of life, and that being much more important than quantity of life. And my mom was 82 at the time. So she'd had a very large quantity of life. But at that point then, and then they were bathing her, and they ended up to clean her face. Then they unbuckled the strap. And when that happened, my mom spit the tube out on Sunday night, because that's how much she was like, I'm not doing this. And
that's quite a clear statement without words. Yeah.
And so the doctor were apologetic, or we're all really sorry, and what's not the proper procedure of how it goes. And I'm like, well, it's pretty emphatic in what she wanted to do. And then it was a question of, okay, but she's still having a lot of problems swallowing, so we're going to put a feeding tube on her. And I was like, no, that's not what she wants, and that will not be what she wants. The three of us, I think a nurse and a couple other medical people were there. And the doctor was like, well, she can't really swallow, so are we talking now about palliative care? And I was like, yes, we are. And it was a very easy decision, because my mother had been very, very clear in what her wishes were.
That was such a gift to you.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Both my parents had made it clear to me too. And it's still hard to let them go for the obvious reasons. But when they make it clear to you and you realize it's really that's what they want, and it's for their benefit.
Right. So after we told the doctors that, and then they're talking about moving her out of the ICU because she was no longer intubated and into palliative care, my brother and I went down into the lobby of the hospital.
That must have been a tough conversation.
It was. And it was like, because then we started doing the second guessing thing. Are we doing this? Do you want to have one more conversation with her? Do you want to have one more, whatever? And then we started doing the practical thing of, mom's not going to be able to do this, and mom's not going to be able to do that. And it's sort of one of those things of it's accepting reality as opposed to imposing what you want to happen.
Right.
And my mom really died of that stroke. And we don't deal very well with death in our society currently.
That's an understatement.
And we all kind of have this, because I think we're not connected to it in a way that our previous generations did.
And I think we refuse to be.
True.
Nobody wants to talk about the end, or that anything's going to end, or even, God forbid, getting into your later years.
Yeah. And that's tough. And again, a lot of people who are older, or I've talked to, are like, getting old is not for the faint of heart. It's, the aches and pains and the things you can't do, and the way people respond to you. And there's a lot of difficulty in doing that if you take the dark side of it. So my brother and I in the lobby, then we kind of went through, or like, all right, let's think this through. let's look at all that. My brother and I were debate partners in high school. And so we kind of like, let's step back for a second. Let's lay it all out like we used to do on at my dad's chalkboard. And, this is the argument. And then we would take both sides of it. And we were both, kind of saying, all right, then this is kind of what we have to do. And then it becomes the logistics sets of all of that. And my brother is a scientist, and was really great at like figuring out options of treatment. He was really instrumental in doing all right, whatever our options are. And then mine was really kind of, I'm the logistics person. So now that we've made this decision, what do we have to do? And my mom had signed a DNR and
which is a do not resuscitate order. Yeah.
And she had all the paperwork and had gone to the lawyers, which was all really great. And so I had all the documentation that I had all the authority to it.
Well, and let's talk about the difference between medical care and palliative care, which is mostly with regard to hospice.
Yeah. Well, palliative care basically says you make people as comfortable as possible. So you're not going to do extraordinary measures. So in this case, the extraordinary measures would be to put my mom on a feeding tube and then start the whole series of, physical therapists going through there and occupational therapists and treatment to see how much movement and swallow tests and all of that. And at the point at which we said, no, we're going toward palliative care, then it's about making someone as comfortable as possible and seeing how the body naturally will heal or not.
How it'll react.
Yes. Because sometimes you go into palliative care and that gives your body a breather and the natural healing parts come through, and you are then make a different decision that it is time for other paths. That was not going to happen with my mom. They're still trying to do a lot of the things that you want to have doctors do, which is try and save you. But the doctor, when I was having the conversation with him, was, look, and he basically said, I can't kill her. And I'm like, I'm not asking you to kill her. I'm asking you to let her be comfortable. And he was like, well, but we don't want to speed it along. And I was kind of saying, you're not doing anything. If your idea is to give her comfort and to help her, this is not helping her. This is not, the decisions and the wheels are already in motion. And so let's figure out how we can get her to hospice, and let's figure out how to make her comfortable and to follow her wishes. And I really had to be very, very adamant about saying that my mom, she valued her voice. She valued her ability to be able to express her opinion. And she spent hours and hours quilting, which required the use of both of her hands. She was not going to be able to do any of those things. And that's what gave her joy. So he was not doing her any favors by extending this period out.
That's so true. And people don't realize with hospice that it doesn't mean that you're going to die. It's just you have a condition that may eventually lead to your passing, but people recover in hospice and go off hospice.
Yeah.
So it's really about making you comfortable and still taking care of you, but just not going to extraordinary measures.
Right.
Like a feeding tube, intubation, that sort of thing.
Right. And it's about also preparing you for what the next stages will be.
Let nature take its course in as comfortable a way as possible. Does that make sense?
Yes. And that was, using just tranquilizers and things to calm my mom down as this process was happening. And I was there through pretty much every shift change because there were so many nurses that took care of my mom. It was talking to them all the time about what was going on. And then the hospital's there, do you want food? And like, my mom's not eating anything. I don't want anything. And I don't want the smell of the food in the room. And then, somebody was coming through and played music for her. And it was I took one of her quilts and brought it in and put it across her. And then it was a couple of days to try and get her into hospice. We got to hospice I think by about 3 or 4 in the afternoon.
Mhm.
And I hadn't had anything to eat because I'd been waiting on them to do the transfer, and the transfer was about somebody signing off on what the contents of my mom's purse. And once we finally got that done and the ambulance there, then we arrived. My brother arrived. We kind of hung out for a little while. We were, and then I went to go grab dinner. I just pulled into the parking lot of a restaurant, and the hospice nurse called me and said that your mom had passed away. And my brother and I, before we had left the hospice, had a conversation with the nurse there, saying, do we think we're 24 hours away? Do we think we're moments away? Do we think we're 3 or 4 more days away? And she was saying that usually it takes someone between 7 and 10 days to die.
Well,
And
your mom had should we call it an itinerary or a list?
yeah, my mom was ready to get on with it. So and she'd also said, the nurse had also said that your mother's in active dying, and that usually is, I think, 48 hours.
On both ends of life, there's kind of a gestation period coming
Right.
in and going out, which is painful and unpredictable, which is really fascinating to me because there is this process at the
Yeah.
end of life. And again, hopefully people need to start talking about it so they're more comfortable with it.
That's true. And that's something that nobody really talks about, is what all this is. And so as soon as I heard, then I called my aunt, who is my mom's only surviving sibling. And they were very close. And then talked to my brother, and my brother came back up, and we both sat with my mom for a few minutes. But my mom wasn't there. I mean, that's the thing, is I didn't feel her presence there. Mom was ready to get on with it. So I stayed there for a little while, and then I went and found a quiet place in the hospice. And my brother had done the same thing in a different place. And then we kind of, after about half an hour or so, found each other and just kind of started talking a little bit.
Can I ask you, in that time by yourself, what was going through your mind and your heart?
It was a lot of ums there. And it was welcoming. It was basically saying, Mom, have a safe journey. And it was me telling her in my head how much I loved her and how much I was going to miss her, but how proud I was of her to have the courage to do what needed to be done, and a little sadness for not having the couple of months that we had. Maybe I could have prevented some of the things leading up to the stroke, which is kind of silly. Strokes are not something you can prevent, but
and also you can't see for a pandemic coming necessarily.
No.
So there you go.
Well, and that's the irony too, is that if Mom had, if the stroke had happened 3 weeks to a month later, then the time I spent with my mom and being her advocate so she could die the way she wanted to, I would not have been able to do.
They wouldn't have let you in the hospital. That's right.
So they would have put a feeding tube into her. They would have done the extraordinary measures to let her physically survive, but they would not have, she emotionally wouldn't have survived. And she certainly wouldn't have been going into full-time nursing care, which is where she would need to be to do recovery. So my mother would have died miserably in that.
And alone.
And alone. Yeah.
One of the things that I thought was very impressive was how well you and your brother worked together during all this.
My brother and I have been close since we were kids. And we were, as I said before, we were debate partners together. So we're used to working a problem together. And we've always been able to, communicate on some level and know each other, and I think trust each other really well. So as I mentioned earlier, then my brother is a scientist, and he was really good about investigating, what our options were and doing some really deep dive, into what probabilities of, recovery were, and to be able to translate some of the medical and scientific stuff in a really good way. And then I'm the one practical one that gets us from point A to point B. I mean, the critical points were when we're sitting there talking to the doctors and saying, so what are you saying? Are you saying palliative care? Are you saying, put the feeding tube in? And I'm very clearly saying, no, we're not putting the feeding tube in. And so we're going for palliative care. And I'm like, I'll sign whatever you want to, because I have had multiple conversations with my mother and I know this. And they were like, okay. And I'm like, I had the papers that said I was the executor and that I had the directive and that it was within my powers. So in doing that, my brother and I had some conversations too of like, she has a directive, but she's always wanted to fight. And I'm like, yeah, when there's a possibility that she's going to come out okay on the other side. And I think that's what all of us want. If there's a possibility that you can go back to normal, absolutely, you want them to try whatever they need to do.
Of course, but in a way, she was fighting.
She was, yes.
To make sure that you knew. Like
yes.
she was, and that's a gift. She was making it clear to you, I want to go. My mom died when I was only 26 and she was only 58. She had colon cancer.
Yeah.
And somewhere along the line, the New York Times had an article about you need to talk to your parents or parent about the will.
Right.
And I read through that and I thought, because we have some family dynamics going on in my family, we'll just leave it at that for now.
Mm-hmm.
And the next time I was home visiting my father, we went on a little walk around the neighborhood in Buffalo. I believe I started by saying, I'm going to ask you a question, Dad, kind of a difficult one. And I just want you to know, I only care that documents are made out and there won't be any squabbling when you're gone. So I just want to make sure, have you set up your will? Is it airtight, signed, everything? Because, and this is before I was in the profession I am in now, but I now hear so many stories about finding wills or trust documents in a drawer and they haven't been signed.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. I said, I don't care who gets what. I just want to know that there won't be any legal fights because it's going to be hard enough to lose you. I will miss you terribly.
Yeah.
And he really seemed to appreciate that and started saying, oh, it's all taken care of. It's split up between the three of you girls and you'll each get an equal part. I said, Dad, I don't need to know that.
Right.
Thank you. But that's not my biggest concern. I just don't, while I'm grieving losing you, I don't want to also be having to fight my siblings.
Right. And that was because of Mom's experience, then we also had my dad do a directive, which was very helpful when he had his stroke for my brother and the legal stuff we had to do. My father wanted to live to be 100, and he literally fell out of his skin as he was dying. And his optimism was, I'm still going to break this. I'm still okay. And the Parkinson's had gotten to the point where he was having hallucinations. And so it was becoming difficult for him and for us. And that was another thing of my father might have physically been there, but the father that I knew and I still loved him, obviously, but the person that I had 5 years to grieve my father because he had died. Really, the father that I knew had died when he had the stroke 5 years earlier. So it wasn't all bad, but there were also some, my dad was bedridden and in diapers, and it was not, my father had been driving up until the moment and living alone up until the moment that he had the stroke. And he was a golfer, and he was, a lot of things that he was not able to do in a 10 by 20 room or 10 by 12. I lost both my parents within a 2-year period. So, and that's been in the last 3 years. So it's still very fresh, and there's still lots of things I'm like, oh, my mother was a women's history teacher, and this was the 100th year anniversary of women getting the vote. And I was like, oh, I wish I'd ask her about this. But there's all these things that you don't get a chance to talk about until they're gone, and you don't even think of the questions. And that's one of the things I'm doing with my aunt. My mom had delved really deeply into family history and done it from a historical standpoint as well as the family history part of it. I think it was really important in that conversation we had in the lobby after we had just made the decision, because I think in hearing other people's stories, that was a critical moment, because my brother and I were in agreement that this is what we were doing and that this was the right thing to do, as opposed to one or more of the family members saying, no, but she's got to survive and she can still live through this, and all that kind of stuff that you have of people not being able to let go. And once we'd made the decision that mom was going to die, then it became, all right, how do we make her comfortable? What papers do we need to sign? She wanted to be cremated. So it was arranging that.
What people don't realize, as soon as someone passes, there is this enormous list of things that instantly need to be taken care of. The funeral arrangements, the obituary.
My mom she had been a teacher in Oklahoma, but she didn't have a huge number of friends here in Huntsville. And so she didn't really want to have a funeral, I think out of part of a fear that no one would show up, which the irony of how many people were affected by her death and how they rallied around me said that she was more loved than she thought she was. And then mom was like, my ashes need to go to Pensacola, Florida.
Why Pensacola?
My mom loved the ocean. And so she would go, there were several points in her life where she would go and spend several weeks to several months.
Spending, her next evolution, whatever that may be, on the beach or near the beach.
Right. So,
not a bad thing.
Yeah. And my mom, I don't think there was anything really left unsaid, because in our family, it was always, you should spend time with people while they're alive. You should express your feelings with them while you're alive. You should do it on not for special holidays. You should do it every day. And so we'd sort of been living that way for the last several years. So there wasn't much that was left. I would, every time I left the hospital room, I would say to my mom, I love you. And so in my heart, I'd been saying it.
Nancy, I want to thank you so much for being this open with us about your whole experience with your mother's passing. It's been so touching and also, I think, really informative for people. Thank you for your courage. In the next episode, you will hear about Nancy's journey as the executor. That was a year and a half ago that your mom died, and you're still dealing with some things. And Nancy will be here to speak about it in her remarkable way. Thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to How to Move Your Mom and Still Be on Speaking Terms Afterward. Please visit howtomoveyourmom.com for more information about this episode and for additional podcast episodes featuring other extraordinary guests and conversations. Until next time, this is your very grateful host, Marty Stevens-Huebner.